Welcome to our event on state trafficking. Welcome to our speaker and to you for joining us from around the world. My name is Joanna Hewitt-James. I'm Executive Director of Freedom United. We're a global mass community against all forms of modern slavery, raising awareness and turning that awareness into action to build power for change, a world resilient to modern slavery. Thank you for joining us today. We're talking about the concept of state trafficking that might seem new, but as those of us familiar with the transatlantic slave trade know, it's of course as old as slavery itself. And there's not a whole lot of information online about the concept state trafficking. What is there is mostly referring to the expulsion of migrants and refugees from Tunisia to Libya. So to help us along with this conversation, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Hyab Yohannes. Dr. Hyab is the UNESCO Chair on Refugee Integration. He is the author of The Refugee Abyss and so much more. He's currently a lecturer in forced migration and decolonial education at the University of Glasgow, where you can see his full bibliography. So, since he's an academic, which I am not, I have warned him that I'll be interrupting if I don't follow what he's saying. Please also, to you, post in the chat if you have any thoughts. We'll be monitoring it closely. We want this conversation to be with you, so I really want to encourage everyone to get involved. As well as the chat, there's also a Q&A feature beneath our image. That's the best place to post your questions. If we call on you when we get to our questions, be ready to answer your question live. When we call on you, we'll set your status so that you can unmute yourself and ask your question yourself. So before launching into our conversation and unpacking how global systems commodify migrants and refugees and uphold exploitation, I'd like to lay out my thoughts on the topic and why now is a good time for this conversation. For those of you who know us, you'll be aware that Freedom United is a platform to explore and pursue angles in the anti-trafficking agenda that do not get adequate exposure, such as prison slavery in the United States, refugee pushbacks into Libya, and promoting decriminalization to end trafficking for sexual exploitation. These topics are not always easy for others to work on. However, a future without exploitation will not be possible if the sector focuses only on the criminal aspect of modern slavery. We must expose how embedded and endemic exploitation is in global economic and social systems. So the concept of state trafficking brings together practice by governments that pushes people into extreme exploitation. Evidence of this has emerged from all corners of the world, including from Italy, who directly fund coastguards to push people in the Mediterranean Sea back to Libya, to China, moving persecuted peoples from the Xinjiang Autonomous Region around China to other regions in so-called labor transfers, forced to work in industry. And to also even to the United States, sending so-called gang members to El Salvador. If you're not familiar with Freedom United, we're a united community of survivors and allies who together are creating power behind calls for change for a world that's more resilient to exploitation. And we know of our community in response to surveys that there's a real interest in and inspiration behind our safe migration campaign, which calls for safe pathways for movement as a means of building resilience to trafficking. And there's an interconnection between this idea of safe pathways and safe migration and state trafficking, which we'll be exploring today. So the anti-trafficking sectors looked at trafficking for a long time as a criminal problem. And of course, there's little doubt that that is the case. It's probably one of the probably is the least prosecuted crimes, or at least one of the most. The problem with the focus on a criminal response is it avoids perhaps an even more uncomfortable truth. That is the entrenched nature of state involvement in trafficking. It also brings into focus the shift, perhaps more in perception than reality, but the shift of the role of democratic governments from upholders of human rights to violators. I mean, I say perception rather than reality because, as we know, their wealth has often been built on exactly this form of extreme exploitation. So when it comes to state trafficking, it's not just the preserve of states that are considered non-democratic, such as North Korea and Turkmenistan, which we've heard about in the context of state-sponsored forced labor in the cotton industry. The term of state trafficking gives us space to consider also the intersection with marginalized identities and trafficking, including refugees and migrants who remain at the sharp end of many governments' policies. So Freedom United, we launched in 2017 with the My Story, My Dignity campaign, which seeks to change the way that experiences of modern slavery are presented, both to more accurately reflect the reality of extreme exploitation and to stop the exploitation of the very people who lived those experiences. And what we've seen over the past decade of pushing out our message is a step change in the anti-trafficking sector and how the topic is discussed. So it's in this context that I frame this conversation we'll be having today on state trafficking. We need to have our eyes open to the true picture of the challenge ahead. So to open the conversation, I'm going to put some questions to Dr. Hyab, and then we'll be inviting you to also participate. So to open the conversation, and welcome again, Dr. Hyab, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Just to open this conversation, I'd just like to ask you what state trafficking means to you.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. And thank you, Joanna, for the invitation. Maybe before I come back to your question, I just want to introduce a little bit more about myself. I am originally from Eritrea. I was born and grew up in Eritrea and studied in Eritrea until my undergrad. And then I had to leave because of some perceived or even actual kind of concrete fears of persecution in Eritrea. And I lived in Sudan, in Egypt before coming to the UK, and I also experienced some of these state trafficking and other forms of trafficking that we will be discussing today. And part of my reflections will be related to some kind of lived experiences, but also embodied and learned knowledges as well. And the second thing to say is that I am right now working on a kind of a book chapter with someone, a dear friend and colleague called Tess Fallon on a state trafficking specifically, and some of my reflections might touch some of these kind of things that we're working together. And yeah, and just want to acknowledge that. And to come back to your question, Joanna, I think the answer is already implied in the question, and you have summarized it really well as well. But let me start with some examples as you did. And I think we all know what the Australian offshore detention systems and the Australian detention offshore detention system, for example, started in 2001 with an incident called MV Tampa incident. Tampa is basically a Norwegian freight or a ship that rescued over like 433 people seeking asylum, and they're mostly from Afghanistan. And then the ship tried to bring those people to the mainland Australia, but the Australian government denied the ship entry and deployed some special forces to seize it and transferred the refugees to Nauru, which is an island country next to Australia, which is not far. And this basically it started with a denial of the right to seek asylum of these people who were rescued by a ship in the middle of the sea. And then following this, then the government started to legislate what it was trying to do and what it was actually doing. And it created a bill called the Border Protection Bill to legalize the operation. And following this legalization and the initial kind of intervention, Then detention centers were built in Nauru, and detention centers were built in Papua New Guinea, which are former Australian colonies, and currently they're basically Australia's asylum colonies rather than the former colonies. And since 2001, over 5,800 people were believed to have been detained in those two places, in those two small island countries. And some detainees were forcibly returned to their home countries, some Iranians, for example. And beyond all these things that Australia was doing by itself, it was also creating some kind of international agreements with these two countries in the first place, with Nauru and Papua New Guinea, but also with international organizations like the UNHCR, initially for refugee status determination, and later with IOM as well for logistics and deportation reasons as well. So this kind of alliance between the state and international organizations completes the creation of an offshore carceral regime where the state trafficked people are taken hostage outside the territory of a given nation state, which is Australia in this case. And the rationale given was that for border security and stopping evil smugglers, these are the language that we keep hearing all the time, and prevention of deaths in the sea, and also deterrence and other things. These are basically the grammars of coloniality, as I call them in some of the research. And I have no burden of explaining this to you at this stage because I have a question for me. And we can also give the other examples, like the UK Rwanda deal, for example, which is conceived as an offshore detention plan as well, similar to the Australia's one. And millions were spent on failed implementation, and later it was deemed unlawful by the UK Supreme Court based on what I call colonial reasoning. If you carefully read the reason which was given for illegalizing it, it was not because of what the UK as a country was doing to the people, some of whom could actually be victims of trafficking, who come to this country and then arrested arbitrarily and taken to Rwanda. Those are not the actors that the court has tested as a domestic court, but the safety of Australia, a kind of an ex-colonial country. How is it possible for a domestic court to decide on the safety of another country and not even check what this country that the court is meant to check the power of that state? It's not even considered at all. So it illegalized this. It was deemed unlawful mainly because Rwanda was deemed unsafe for those people. But how is the UK supposed to be safe? It is just deporting them and kidnapping them basically on the streets upon arrival. So these questions are very deep, not just at a kind of political level, but also at the legalities of these processes and the courts and everything. And then we can look at the institutional practices in general. We can also look at the EU practices in Libya, funding, and as you've rightly mentioned it, Joanna, funding and training of coastguards and police forces. And refugees were forcibly returned to Libya in many occasions. We have seen a lot of examples over the past few years where they faced abuse and torture by organized militias and traffickers. And many of them are also victims of trafficking, as I have studied this as well as part of the book that you were referring to. And I would also like to mention the US and Mexico border as well. What happened is they're not just recently of what's happening right now, but even before, like a few years ago, when the government was basically separating children from their parents and deporting the parents, but taking the children to the US. What does that mean? How is a country supposed to be safe for children who are basically kidnapped and separated from their children? So these are some of the questions we can ask, and we can also look at the laws to criminalize and punish those seeking asylum, and also the recent banning of refugees from entering the US, for example. I was working with a group of people in Cairo, to just give you an example, and they had visas to travel to the US under a resettlement program called Welcome Corps. And as a part of the normal processes, then they had to close their UNHCR files in Cairo. They were people seeking asylum and refugees, recognized refugees in Cairo. And they also had to get a permanent exit from Egypt as well. So at that moment, when they had their flights and everything organized, then Trump canceled all their visas. What happened then was Egypt is telling them, you have already got your permanent exit to leave Egypt. You have to leave from this country. And then UNHCR cannot register them because they have already closed their files, and the Egyptian government would not allow them even to register with UNHCR because they have already had permanent exit. And the US government would not let them to come to the US. So what happened to these people? This is a state trafficking in the form in way that the state is not trafficking them to specific territorial places or physical places, but to what is called state of exception, to spaces of lawlessness. There is no law that can protect these people. There is nowhere that they can go to. So the part of the dimension of the state trafficking is also not just to traffic and contain and take people hostage in offshore detention, but actually illegalizing them from everywhere so that they become killable, so that they become disposable bodies. So they are completely outside of any kind of protection scheme, whether it's from humanitarian organizations or state apparatus or from their home country. So that kind of creating a space devoid of law, of protection, of dignity, that in itself is part of a state trafficking people into places where people are not people anymore, but just bodies that can be killed. So these are some of the reflections I'm trying to work with, and the state trafficking basically is that the state is now not just not protector, a benign entity that we thought it was, but is trafficking, actually actively engaged in these forms of trafficking. It writes immigration laws that legitimize violence. Some of these laws that do not sound lawful, right? They're designed to actually create harm, legalize. And what is happening at this institutional level is that violence is inscribed within the institutions, such as law and other kind of state institutions, for example, the Home Office in the UK. And the other thing is that the state trafficking and the creation of such kind of carceral systems does is also it allows the state to discipline citizens and civil society to prevent resistance, any kind of resistance against violence. So what does it mean to live in a situation where there is a violence and any resistance against that violence is basically legalized? So it's the normalization of the violence itself is creating the spaces and the conditions for state trafficking. And we all know all of these kind of things happen in a completely broad daylight with absolute impunity because the state is almost the only entity that is unaccountable. So I think I would start with this kind of reflection and invite people to think about these things for now.
Thank you so much. I think it's so useful to have you bring together all these threads of concepts that we're aware of and show us how they do connect and how the concept of state trafficking as a term just allows us to do that. I hadn't thought about Australia, but it's so obvious now that you raise it that this is really where the role of the state started in moving people on its own terms, even outside its jurisdiction. I think the examples you brought up are really quite powerful. I think a lot of people will have seen videos of ICE raids where people are literally swept from the streets in the US. The example you gave as well of Egypt, I think, is less known. So in that case, the US policy to refuse to accept the refugees, did it leave those people stateless, like in some kind of status without status, I guess. Is that what happened in that case?
Yeah,
Lim
it's not even a question of stateless. Even as a stateless, you're supposed to claim asylum, right? But these
Right.
completely denied any sort of asylum, whether it's in Egypt or in the US or any other country, and they cannot go back to their home country. And I've heard recently some of these people are already detained and put in the underground cells, and some of them are just escaping and trying to go to Libya and other places because there is not any way that they can stay in those places, and they're becoming victims of further trafficking and others. So it's not even about being stateless where you can claim to protection in the name of stateless. This is basically you're nothing. They are nothing.
Beyond statelessness. I mean, statelessness, I think for a lot of people sounds serious enough, but we're actually talking about beyond that. That's yeah, that's the breadth I think is pretty shocking. You also touched in your introduction about the body, and I think in your book as well, in the Refugee Abyss, you talk about how people are commodified, which of course is exactly the definition of slavery, people being treated as property. So I wonder if we could just explore that in particular about how state trafficking as a concept plays a role in this commodification.
Yeah, and let me say a few things about slavery first and how it is defined, particularly in this kind of academic in
That
the
would be
academia
helpful.
spheres that I worked with. And a professor called, I should remember, he was a Cameroonian professor, who's also a famous theorist. He talks about trafficking, slavery, as a kind of as a result of three profound losses. And one of the losses is the loss of home. And it's both in its physical and metaphysical sense. There is no home for a trafficked person. They're already taken away from that physical home, but also the body as a home. The body as a home is also something they have already lost. So the second loss he talks about is the loss of the right over one's own body. That also makes people slave. And the last loss he talks about is the loss of political status, that they do not have any protection, or what Aaron famously called the right to have rights. They have already lost the right to have rights. And in the past, slavery was all about finding a people to enslave and finding an enemy to crush. But today, the modern slavery, as we call it here, is about creating slave. It's not anymore about finding slaves elsewhere, but about creating slaves for perpetual exploitation and creating enemies against whom the nation state can define and justify it as necropolitics, the politics of death. So, and these kind of conditions is what Fanon, one of the colonial thinkers, calls the amputation of being, which is basically a separation of the body from the human. So once the human is separated from the body and the human is murdered, what remains is just the body, a physical flesh and bones, a body that is killable, a body that can be destroyed without a second thought, a body that can be contained in particular spaces, whether it's a refugee camp or offshore detention, wherever you can take that body, you can contain that body without any kind of legal consequences, with a complete impunity. And that body can also be exploited. It can be enslaved for various purposes, like you've mentioned the example in China, for example, or North Korea or other places as well. And that body, if it loses its value, its capital value in terms of exploitation or in terms of sexual exploitation, if it loses its value, then the value, that body, then can be killed, disposed of. So that kind of body is what Fanon calls the amputation of the body, the reduction of the body into just flesh and bone. And this is what these kind of structures we're talking about are creating, and they're creating the underpinning conditions for the creation of the body as an amputated body, a body stripped of its humanity, and its humanity is already murdered. So those those kind of things are the things that create the examples that I have given in Cairo, for example. And and yeah, and trafficking and slavery are not separate. I know they don't seem to be completely different from each other nowadays. They've already uh, merged together almost. The trafficking is another form of slavery, another, and that's what I argue in the book as well. When the abyss that you've mentioned it about, in that as Atlantic slave trade is now moved to the Mediterranean, where people are facing it now as we speak, and for years now, for decades.
Yeah, that is, yeah, that is very true. I think thinking about the way that you've talked about slavery really gives a personal experience of what it actually is like to be in that experience and to go through it. This idea of killing the human and being left with the body, I think, would really resonate with people who've been through that experience. It makes a lot of sense to me. Do you think there's I'm really grateful as well that you gave an explanation of how you see slavery and modern slavery, because it is, it doesn't have a legal framing. It's an umbrella term that we use to talk about different forms of extreme exploitation, be it trafficking for sexual exploitation, bonded labor, domestic servitude, or sadly the many ways in which people are exploited. But do you think there's opportunities, which is not sounds like a positive word. That's not. I'm not framing it in a positive way. But is there something that can change the way that we see human trafficking when we use a term like state trafficking? Like, how do you see that the term can change the way we see this idea of human trafficking and modern slavery?
I think so. At least it will resonate at a structural level what these kind of things are doing, and maybe we can think about trafficking and modern slavery are deeply entangled with the unchecked power of the state now, and that is really powerful and really permanent kind of position to be when an unchecked power of the state is associated with trafficking of the most extreme vulnerabilities that human beings can suffer from. And it's also about the law is not a neutral or a benign force now. It's often infused with violence and particularly with racial violence. And we've seen this as in the example of Australia and the example of others as well that happened in the Mediterranean or other places as well. And with the refugees in Cairo who are stuck in Cairo. And I also think that tend to question the idea of the rights-based international regime as if and nowadays it has already been domesticated by the nation state itself. When the idea of a right is domesticated by the nation state and rationed by the nation state itself, fully controlled, then we lose who is the human in the human rights that we talk about all the time. And why do we need to talk about human rights more than we talk about humans in this place? And if these refugees and other kind of groups of vulnerable people that we're talking are actually humans, then why do we have even refugee riders? Why do we even have humanitarian or other kind of riders for these extremely marginalized populations? And I think it begs the question that the idea of the universal right is like its universal application and significance, and is deeply colonial in its origin and how it has been applied and enforced in different parts of the world. State trafficking can also, yeah, raise an urgent need for a theory of change. How do we begin to imagine change from these kind of extremely vulnerable positions, a shift from violability and killability and disposability of bodies towards a restoration of human dignity is an urgent kind of call now. And how do we move towards that kind of direction, where there is a kind of a theory of change in a theoretical sense of that, but also in practical sense of that, as many organizations have a theory of change all the time. But how do you imagine that theory of change now when the state is actually the perpetuator of some of these crimes that we're trying to address and challenge? And I think it also raises questions about the ideas of inclusion for me, for example. What does it mean to include into systems like this? What does it mean, for example, to integrate into hostile environment in the UK when the state is actively creating hostile environments for people trying to seek asylum because of their conditions, the really horrible conditions, escaping war and other situations? And then what does it actually mean? What does actual inclusion mean when it is about you don't speak your language, you have to learn this language, you have to accustom to these systems that are already violent to your own existence? Then what does that mean? And these are, yeah, these are some of the questions we can raise around the ideas of inclusion. And I often use the term non-exclusion rather than inclusion, because non-exclusion is a kind of a radical openness. It's about an invitation and openness rather than including people into systems that are already violent. So how do we move from ideas of inclusion to ideas of non-exclusion? And how do we move from this kind of tinkering around critiquing systems? And when we know critique produces answers that are already locked within the systems, that are actually these kind of systems we're talking about are designed to allow us to critique them, and critique makes them smart. But how do we move from that position of critiquing to position of questioning them as bigger grand systems, where they also encompass violence, they also include within them embedded is also violence? So how do we move from that position of critiquing to questioning, and how do we even begin to understand a theory of a relation where irreducible relations are built between human beings rather than a state intervening and defining a relationship and how I relate to other people? What the,
Yeah.
where does those kind of interventions leave us as people who seek to have some form of political agency?
And I think we are interested in change. Obviously, we're interested in a world where these extreme forms of exploitation don't happen. So I'm really like to pick up on that um, point that you made in particular. And I think there's a good question for us all to think about, is very much challenging our way of operating to really question this rights framework when you talk about the fact that the state itself has power over the granting of those rights and selecting how those rights are granted. It's very much questioning a assumption, I think, that a rights-based framework makes sense. But I think you, of course, have your own experiences. And I think they probably inform a lot of your thinking of the role of the state in this question. And I wonder what it's taught you, your own experience as a refugee, as you talked about in the opening, what it's taught you about government's role. Because as you did say earlier, we're led to believe, let's say, that the government's role is to protect us. But I think it's very evident from the examples that we've talked about in this conversation that that's actually often not the case. And that can be true in many different jurisdictions. So I think we will like to talk about change, but before we talk about how we maybe can get towards change, let's question a little bit the government's role. Could you tell us and share a little bit about how your experience of being a refugee, what it's taught you about how the government can or cannot protect us from modern slavery, which is how we're currently framing the protection system?
Yeah, maybe in general terms, I think the time I became a refugee, crossing the border to Sudan, this is what in 2011, March 26th. So what I really felt was not the becoming of refugee, but also the unbecoming of the citizen that I was before becoming a refugee. So there is a simultaneous process in the process of becoming refugee, where you also unbecome who you were or what you were as a citizen of a one country who perceives that there is some sort of protection because I belong to this nation and it's going to protect me and I have rights within these kind of boundaries and all of that. And all of that gradually vanishing, and then you're becoming something new, extremely vulnerable category that can only be defined by well-founded fear of persecution, which was an idea as a kind of a formula granted, given by this convention itself, the Refugee Convention. So what does it mean to unbecome a citizen and become that vulnerable subject? who can only be defined by a well-founded fear of persecution, who can only perform a victimhood in front of a powerful state to seek asylum, or in front of humanitarian organization that produces, that gives you rationed food, where you are basically left to stay indefinitely in refugee camps, for example, and in a kind of a state of injury, as a member would say, a permanent state of injury, living in this destitution. So these are the things that you deeply feel when you, I deeply felt when I became a refugee. And it was also very clear to me that the human security is less important than the border security. So the border security becomes everything. Oh, there are refugees coming this side of the border. We need to block them. We need to take them, deport them. All of that thinking. Is it because these people coming are just refugees, not humans? They are not human enough to be protected, or their human security is subordinated to the border security. So all these are very kind of structural kind of questions and violence that is really embedded in the structures of the nation state. And it's also, yeah, and I clearly felt how the state has incorporated violence in their kind of governmentality and the sovereignty, the ideas of nation state, national security, and all of that, and war against terror, and all of these things that we keep hearing over the last decades or even more. All of this are designed to incorporate violence and legitimize some form of violence against particular groups of people, and with a complete impunity. And I think this sounds excessively grim, but we're all potential refugees in the hands of a nation state. Every human being is a potential refugee, whether it's through climate-related kind of devastations, whether it's political marginalization when we're trying to say this is wrong, and then the state says no, you can't say, you're not allowed to say that. Then what do we do? Where is our agency as human beings? We might think we're just living in a state where we have passports and travel, but we're actually queuing in airports and being asked to take off our belts and shoes and everything. And that has become the law of these places, right? And where is the agency? Where is the freedom that was promised in the name of the nation state in that case? Um, and I think, and this is also very clear, that the human security itself, as I said earlier, is secondary to the border security. And it's very clear in why, for example, wars are waged in the name of sovereignty, that a person can be killed in the name of sovereignty. And this is why we are expected to die in the event of war, for example, defending a violent border that we know is so violent against this kind of racialized people, or against ourselves as well, against our travels, mobilities, and all other kind of privileges that we seek. So these are, I think, the things that I noticed it early on, once I crossed the border and stuck in a refugee camp where there are a lot of traffickers, including people who are working in the sector as security services related to the Sudanese government, and also UNHCR security services, who are colluding with traffickers. And at the time, there was a really notorious form of trafficking that we call Sinai trafficking, where thousands of Eritrean refugees were taken to the Sinai and brutally murdered. Close to like thousands of them, is not, and that also involved with organ trafficking and all of that kind of stuff. And state and humanitarian actors were actually colluded. And I'm saying this not just because of my own experience, but also because of the experience of the many people that I worked with as well previously, and now when in the research. So yeah, and these are some of the bigger kind of systemic challenges that I have experienced personally.
Which are pretty serious and really bring into question the role of the state as the protector, without doubt. And I think in your case, of course, multiple states, not even just one, as you pass borders. Some interesting illustrations that you've given us to think about. I think even many people can relate to being asked to take off belts and coats and whatnot, to much more challenging and extremely humiliating experiences that people who are trafficked have gone through. But thinking about the role of governments, I would like to ask Ishiaba Kasonga if they would like to unmute and ask their question, because they in particular want to talk about two governments and their role. So Ishiaba, please go ahead.
Yes, all of you knows that immigration detention industry in the UK creates jobs, and there's a lot of profit in that area when we talk about the hostile environment, that it's criminalizing migrants and putting the public in the status of accepting any narrative coming from the government. So the government can allow any kind of taxpayer money to go in that sector in order to protect the borders, as Dr. just said now, the priority is about the borders. Now, the question I have is, do you think that the one in and one out pilot project implemented by France and the United Kingdom would make these two countries traffickers, since denying people the right to seek asylum could expose them to human trafficking? We have to consider this context in this way. UK did not consider the Dublin III regulation that able people, when they're seeking asylum in another country, if they found out that you did claim asylum in another country, they had to send you back. During the Brexit time, they ignored that pace, and then it happened that EU opened the borders and people are start crossing the channel in this area. Now, it was easy for France or for EU to stop that, because a lot of money went to that area. Over 700 million pounds went to France to stop that. It never happened. We know that buying a boat is not like going to the supermarket. You buy bread. Buying a boat, everyone knows that you buy a boat. So it becomes like an organized chaos, people coming. By implementing this pilot project, UK is ready and emptying its detention, immigration detention, to welcome those people in the detention. And then after, to think about taking them out or sending them back. So my question is just based on looking the commodification of migrants in these two countries.
Do you want me to respond now, Joanna?
Yeah, I think you could maybe also say a little bit more about this scheme for those who are not familiar with it, assuming you know about it.
I'll leave that question to you. But I know, yeah. And yeah, basically this scheme is recently, I think it's very recent agreement between both governments, France and the UK, and trying to return migrants and refugees, people seeking asylum in the UK back to France as Isha, is it Isha? Yeah, describe it. And yeah, and linking it with state trafficking, I think that this is why I'm leaving it open for us to interpret these things in the minute details, but also on the grand scale of these kind of things, where human beings are commodified and bargained for political reasons and for border control reasons, and also for elections and other kind of thinking. And when the government is using this as a kind of election ball, where if you return this, then we'll get some kind of voters from this section of the society. And what these things are beyond the state trafficking. This is actually a dehumanization of a bigger political system. We're not, I don't think it's just about the people that are being trafficked and taken back and forth, but it's also about the systems that we're living in. The systems that do these kind of systems, but also us as individuals, as human beings living in those spaces, not being able to do anything about these things. And in fact, voting for these kind of structures. So it's much, much bigger than this kind of a narrow focus on a particular group of people. It's actually a kind of unraveling of the whole system and manifesting itself as a violent structure, as a hostile environment, as they call it themselves, and creating that hostile environment first to the most vulnerable people. And now it becomes an institutional norm. It becomes normalized across societies. We can see how homeless people are being treated, how disabled people are being treated, how other marginalized groups are being treated by these kind of changes in welfares and all of these kind of things. So I think it begs a broader question that takes into account the role of the state as a holder of this unchecked power and accountable to nobody and accountable to no any kind of institutional framework, but also at the same time creates and designs laws that legitimize violence, then it's invading every sphere of life. So yeah, I don't disagree with what you said. But I think I would take it more broader terms rather than particularly to those particular group of people.
Well, I think your point about commodification is very powerful, because when we're looking at defining trafficking, we're looking at the purposes of exploitation, and the exploitation is often for the labor, as Sandra said in the comments, as long as there's an appetite to go around the establishment for cheaper labor, cheaper or disposable sexual exploitation, then human beings will continue to use each other. And it's very true. And I think what you've made us think about is a broader definition of that commodification. For example, through, as you said, political gains, by using refugees for votes, by pushing them out. And there is still a commodification at play, but it's a very different one from perhaps the financial conventional one that we might more often think of, or the sexual one that we think of with sex trafficking. Elaine's got a very challenging question to ask. Challenging because it's about the UN, which of course is a body that's made up of nation states. But go ahead, Elaine. Let's see what we might think about it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you both for a very thought-provoking contribution. I'm wondering what you have seen happening in response to these abuses of state power by UNHCR, both on the ground and at the more policy-making headquarters discussions that might be going on. I'd really like to know how they're reacting and responding to these breaches of what we might expect to be rules that they would uphold.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Elaine. And I think it's about who has the power to make changes. What powers does UNHCR have to question what these countries are doing? What powers does the UNHCR have to ask Russia to bring the children that were kidnapped from Ukraine, or the children that are kidnapped in the American border in the American-Mexican border? What powers does UNHCR have to tell these countries to create safe routes, particularly in places like Libya or other? And what powers does those countries have, like UNHCR or other organizations have, to ask China to stop the persecution of particular minorities in that country? And yeah, humanitarianism is designed to allow to basically function on the other side of the violent power of the state, as it creates, like some of the scholarship that comes from the global south will say, it creates a system of destitution after a violent system of crushing and war and other things, and then provides a rationed food, whether it's in refugee camp, where people are basically with no other kind of feature, staying in refugee camps for the rest of their lives, just eating bread once or twice a day, and children are born there, and that's how life is supposed to be for those kind of categories of people, and the NHR sustains that. What does that mean for UNHCR to, for example, to operate in places like Eastern Sudan, where I was in refugee camp, where you're only allowed to eat food twice a day, in the morning and late in the evening, and that's it, and that's what you become, and there is no any other kind of durable solution to your condition, and that's why people are just escaping and leaving those spaces. What does it mean for UNHCR and IOM and these organizations to actually train Libyan coastguards, for example, and involved in these kind of processes? And I think structurally, the way these kind of organizations function is always under the power of the state, and the state basically can completely take them out of those countries if they want to. If Egypt wants us to kick out UNHCR, then it can't do so. It's already doing it. It's already started to take over asylum processing and refugee status determination through new legislation of new laws in starting a few months ago, for example. So I think it's the function and the relationship between this humanitarian organization and what it actually meant for particular categories of population, and why they are designed in these kind of frameworks, and what do they do, what are they supposed to do in those kind of spaces where people are impoverished, have lost their state protection, they have lost the right to have any right, and in those situations a humanitarian organization cannot grant any rights. They can only grant food. They can only and do some kind of life-sustaining kind of support with all the good intentions, but always in the shadow of this broader omnipresent power of the state that crashes all these possibilities of life.
Yeah.
This sounds, but yeah.
Right. No, I agree with you. I think it's really, I think we also have to remember that, of course, the United Nations and UNHCR is a reflection of the government systems that we have now that now operate, and what we're actually, I think, would be kind of difficult to imagine them adopting policies that would be in contradiction to what their members are calling for, or the way they believe the system to be right now. This is so sort of fundamental to the way in which states operate, and it's not looked in that way. We're not talking about states as traffickers. I mean, we are today in this event, but broadly, we're talking as criminals, as traffickers, and we're not putting states in that bucket. So this is something that's really challenging the current status quo. And that's why it's something that's very thought-provoking, unlikely right now to be adopted, but not to say that there's not a potential future that could be different, that could re-examine the way that we look at this issue. And I think that is really important. I think for now we don't have any more questions to answer. There is one in the box about if there's any provision for applying for unique ID cards for refugees, but I don't think that will get to the core of the issue that we're talking about today, which is I don't think it would address the question of whether states are actually pushing people into situations of exploitation. So I think for now we can instead take a moment to reflect on how we see a future, how we see change can happen, and the kind of world in which is one where people aren't exploited. We've got a campaign on safe migration. I mentioned it in my introduction at the beginning. We'll put the link in the chat. Please, if you haven't already signed our petition calling for safe migration as a means of building resilience to exploitation, please do so. Hyab, I wonder if you had anything to say particularly about the importance of safe migration, perhaps in the context of change in the future with less exploitation.
Yeah, it's something that I try to explore in the book as well, but without much hope, because I try to systematize these things and see from a kind of broader thing. I think what I ended up doing in my research is that I moved from idea of trying to create a kind of practical solutions that allow survival of these kind of groups of people momentarily for this time to this idea of maybe writing a different world. If it is impossible, if it sounds impossible for us as human beings, as powerful human beings, to create the freedom that we all yearn, then maybe another option is to write it, to think about writing it, and trying to allow people an alternative. This is a way to live. This is a better understanding of the world and the relationships and all this kind of than all these kind of things that we're talking about here. So for me, as part of the solutions, as part of the clearing the pathways towards that kind of a wallet that can be built outside of this kind of forms of violence, that removes the equation of violence from these systems. I think safe passage as an idea it creates, at least at the perceived level, a sense of freedom and mobility rather than the immobilization that we see. But when it is already contained within the legalities of the nation state, within immigration systems that are already designed to contain the numbers of people who are entering and living and all of that, then how feasible is it as a kind of a solution, as a kind of a durable solution, when the state actually has the powers to stop it, to sanction it at any moment, at any time? And that's what countries are doing right now. And to me, it's not also about just creating safe spaces. It's about creating safe and inhabitable places for these people in their places, in their home countries, in where they originate to be. So it's, if these countries do not want refugees, I think they can stop creating them. These refugees, basically by definition, a state-created kind of problem, a state-created kind of status, when the origin country is basically disposing you, and in collusion with other countries, with destination countries, in wars. Why do we go to Afghanistan, Iraq, all these countries, and bomb them and say, when the Afghan refugees are here and we don't want them? Well, why? What does that mean? Why don't you stop creating them in the first place? So I think the solution is not in creating the conditions that make people refugees and trying to seek safe spaces and safe kind of travel routes for them, but actually eliminating the condition that makes people refugee in the first place.
I like that it's so obvious, and I think Tilda said in the comments that, you know, we have got sadly to a place where not only are we actually creating refugees, but we've also normalized a dehumanization by looking away or buying into what's been sold in the messaging. And I 100% agree with Sandra. We need to agree on how we treat all people. And that includes, of course, immigrants and refugees. We have to really lift the bar in our expectation understanding. No one should be expected to tolerate extreme exploitation. So I do hope that if you've not already, you'll join Freedom United. We've also got a freedom footprint where you can assess your own relationship and impact to modern slavery. We'll put the link in the chat for that. I would like to thank you, Dr. Hyab, for a very thought-provoking conversation. This recording will be available on our YouTube channel later today and on our website under Learn, and then click Live Debates. If you can, do consider making a donation to Freedom United. The button's on our website to support us to hold more great events like this. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining our conversation today. Thank you for your contributions. A massive thank you, Dr. Hyab, for your thought-provoking input. There's so many things that really got my mind ticking. I'm going to be thinking about this for some time yet. I'm really grateful for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciated.
Thank you, everyone, as well. I always appreciate how people are dedicated to the work of making life for other people possible, and it's not easy to devote your entire life just working for these kind of issues and to make life possible for others. And I thank everyone, because I truly believe the people who are here and listening to these really grim stories and reflections are part of this endeavor that makes life possible for others. So thank you.